The average level of global peacefulness has fallen by 0.3%, with Africa accounting for 70% of violent conflicts in the world. The Global Peace Index of 2021 shows that the global impact of violence stood at about 16.5 trillion US dollars, accounting for 10% of global gross domestic product. The United Nations, created with the aim of ensuring peace in the world, is therefore having its toughest challenge yet since its creation, with some actors calling for reforms so that the body can adequately tackle prevailing challenges. In this edition of the program, we go in depth on the role of the United Nations in meeting the challenges of maintaining world peace. What can the University for Peace offer in these troubling times? We shall be going in depth in this edition of the program. Stay with us. My guest has over 20 years of experience in the area of strengthening democratic governance, enhancing human security, conflict management, peace building, as well as human rights. His research interest is on the role of economic and political governance systems in conflict prevention and post-conflict peace building. The Cameroonian scholar is a visiting professor in several universities in Africa, especially in the Great Lakes region, teaching in South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, as well as Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo. He is the African Regional Director at the UN University for Peace and teaches in the main campus in Costa Rica. He holds a PhD in Peace Studies and International Relations, a Master's of Science in International Relations, as well as a Bachelor of Law obtained from the University of Yaoundé here in Cameroon. He is no other than Professor Samuel Ewusi Kale. He is the African Programs Director at the UN University of Peace. Professor Samuel Ewusi Kale, welcome and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, the pleasure is shared. Now, conflict experts say that global peace has declined within the last 15 years, as evident in various conflicts and wars across the world. How disturbing is the situation?
That's a very important question. However, when conflict experts say the peace has declined, they actually do not mean that it's not necessarily violent conflict, because when they talk about peace, they talk about positive and negative peace, and negative peace situations have increased dramatically. Issues of climate change, issues of refugees, migration, those are issues that have to do with peace. In Africa, it's a little bit different. If you take into consideration the decline in United Nations peacekeeping operations, then it tells you that violent conflict, which requires the United Nations, has actually declined. So it's a situation that needs to be comprehensively evaluated. But then the negative peace situations are increasing, and they eventually become violent conflict, because in a negative peace situation, what you actually need is a trigger for violence.
Now, what explains the rise in these negative peace situations?
There are multiple factors, partly issues of climate change, COVID, and then the topsy-turvy nature of the American economy, which affects the global economy. And lately you have the war in Ukraine, which is affecting the world. And so I don't think they've done enough with issues of climate change. The 4 years of Trump's administration in the US was a lost opportunity because it took the Paris Paris Agreement
away from the Paris Agreement.
Yes, and the United States, we need that leadership from the United States. So it was a lost opportunity, and consequently, the effects of climate change have actually led to very, very serious consequences of negative peace situations.
Now, in Africa, how is the situation taking place around the continent?
You know, in Africa, we are always at the receiving end of everything. We are at the periphery of the international system, and therefore, we actually harvest the consequences of things that we actually don't do. Of course, I cannot put the blame entirely on Western countries, the countries in the North, because we have our own governance challenges, things we could have done to mitigate the challenges whose consequences we usually suffer. In Africa, you might have noticed there is a resurgence of coups in West Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and that does not augur well.
And even an aborted coup in Guinea-Bissau.
So yes, yeah. That does not augur well for good governance. In the Horn of Africa, we are facing very serious drought conditions. And then the internal war in Ethiopia had an effect on the other conflicts around the region, like the internal war in South Sudan. Ethiopia was driving the process through IGAD. But then Ethiopia also descended into violent ethnic conflict, and consequently it became very, very difficult for Ethiopia to drive that process of peace in that region because it had its own internal challenges. Somalia, we just had a new government, but then the state of Jubaland is in serious drought and crisis, and so these are all climate-related challenges. Even in South Sudan, a lot of times people limit the analysis of South Sudan to political reasons, but South Sudan is also suffering from very serious climatic conditions. South Sudan, Sudan itself, and Ethiopia as well.
Now, the United Nations was created to ensure global peace. How challenging is it for the UN in tackling these multifaceted situations, which of course hamper peace?
Yeah, the UN does a lot, and the UN is very, very relevant. The challenge is the understanding of a lot of people on what the UN does and what it is supposed to do. Most analysts limit their analysis of UN work with the Security Council and conflict resolution. Much of the UN work centers around specialized agencies. You see the WHO was driving the COVID situation. The UNICEF deals with children. UNDP deals with issues of governance. You know, UNESCO deals with issues of culture of peace, science and technology. So the UN is doing a lot through its specialized agencies. That is not that visible because it doesn't make a lot of noise. But then when it comes to conflict resolution, when there's an outbreak of violent conflict, that is when everybody thinks the UN is necessary. You know, and so much of the UN's work is not actually seen that way.
All right, now the UN has a peace university, and you handle the African program of that particular university, though you teach in the main campus in Costa Rica. Why did the United Nations decide to come up with a university for peace?
If you look at the Charter of the United Nations, it talks about saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold hardship to mankind. And therefore, in 1980, the Costa Rican government sponsored a resolution at the General Assembly that one of the key reasons or the causes of conflict is illiteracy. And therefore, it was critically important for the United Nations to build an institution which will deal with that challenge to lessen the obstacles of peace. And so Costa Rica promoted the resolution at the General Assembly, and resolution 3555 of 5th December 1980 created the University for Peace with headquarters in Costa Rica because they provided the logistics as well.
Now, how does a university function? What are the programs, and how can students enroll into it?
Yeah, it's a global institution. The beauty about the UN University for Peace, where I work, is that you could teach a class of 25 students from 25 countries. And it's a postgraduate school, just masters and PhDs. Sometimes in the university you have about 200 master students from 120 countries. It's a mini United Nations, you know, and so the admissions into the university, most of the programs have to do with international peace studies, gender, human rights, environment, and so on and so forth, development, governance, and so on. But in Africa, we focus more on peace, governance, and development.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the African program.
Yes.
How is it tailored to meet the challenges which Africa is facing at this point in time?
Yeah, in 2002, the university was created in 1980. But in 2002, they decided to create the Africa program. And strangely though, the Africa program was based in Geneva in Switzerland. And the last time I checked, there was no city in Africa called Geneva.
Geneva.
And so some of the members of the board complained that the Africa program had to be in Africa. And in 2005, the Africa program was moved from Geneva to Addis Ababa, which is the diplomatic capital of the continent. The Africa Union is there. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which is the secretariat of the UN, is actually there. And so it was created in Africa. Now, we don't transplant the kind of knowledge that is dished out in Costa Rica to Africa. Africa has its challenges. And so in the development of the programs in Africa, we had to work with the Africa Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to develop programs in Africa that are relevant in Africa. A case in point, our PhD program on peace, governance, and development, it was actually, that title was proposed by Abul Ghasim Wan, who was the Director of Peace and Security at the Africa Union. Yeah. So we said, what are the 3 themes that really affect Africa? It is lack of peace, it is lack of good governance, and it is lack of development. So we tailored our PhD programs like that, and actually developed teaching materials that are relevant to Africa, rather than taking information from Costa Rica and transferring it to Africa. It's not transferable.
All right, Prof. Now, another person who contributed greatly to the African program was the late Kofi Annan, the late Secretary General of the United Nations.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us his input to boosting the African program of the UN University of Peace?
Yes, Kofi Annan is well remembered as someone who, when he became Secretary General of the UN, he saw the importance of education. I remember one of his quotations. He said, peace building is conflict resolution by another name. So he thought about the importance of education to peace, and therefore decided to support the university seriously, because of course the Secretary General is the honorary president of the Council of University for Peace. So Kofi Annan did a lot to make sure that the university is what it is today.
Okay, Prof. Now, one of your research interests concerns the role of economic and political governance system in conflict prevention and post-conflict peace building. How does economic and political governance favor peace?
The silver bullet, which most people will mention, is that, or sometimes they say the elephant in the room is the economy. And Africa needs to take the human security approach rather than the classical security approach. And that's one of the challenges we find in the continent, whereby most conflicts, the approach to resolving most conflicts is the military way. And so a lot of countries spend much of their budget buying military hardware, and that does not augur well for the economy. What are the challenges? What causes this conflict? Unemployment, illiteracy, and so on, poverty, underdevelopment, and so on. Instead of dealing with those things, most African countries spend money buying weapons. For instance, Costa Rica has no army. In 1948, the president said, we cannot have an army, we cannot spend money on military hardware when people can't go to school, when people can't go to the hospital, when people don't have jobs. So they disbanded the army and focused on human security. I think that would be a nice model for the continent. And so politics has to drive towards human security. The economy is the elephant in the room. To deal with the economy, if you look at what people like Paul Kale say about new rules for rebuilding broken nations, the focus is that the international community is more tilted towards supporting political processes rather than economic development, and that's a challenge.
Now, what paradigm do you think that the international community can do? You just mentioned that there's more focus on the political process than the economic process. How should the economic process be accompanied to ensure that it meets the challenges?
Yeah, you see, we have to deconstruct even our educational systems. In a, you know, if we take it from an incisive analysis, we have to deconstruct the manner in which we teach these things. A case in point, the Western paradigm would be that fix the politics. Even Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye the political kingdom first and the rest will follow. That is not correct. And so usually what happens in a lot of African countries is that we have these challenges of unemployment, challenges of poverty, challenges of illiteracy. And then when there is an election, the election becomes a trigger for conflict. Then the international community waits for everything to degenerate into violence, and they send an envoy. The envoy comes and sees maybe the head of state and the opposition leaders and all that. They try to build a political settlement. Now, they have now ignored the elephant in the room, which is what? Economic development, which actually caused that. Now, what usually comes up, if you look at most conflicts in Africa, the way they are resolved, what you usually find is that there's a government of national unity, which encompasses the existing government and those who are co-opted into the system. Now, once the international community does that, they think everything is fine, and they eventually leave. Now, they have not dealt with the root causes of the problem.
Of the problem.
Yes. So what the international community can do is to be able to build that compact which focuses on economic development. Make sure that there's a compact between, even if they do a government of national unity, the UN, if they are peacekeepers to bring about stability, and the donors. But then they should focus on economic development, dealing with issues of poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, and so on, because if you look at the research in Africa, about 40% of conflicts that have been resolved like that have relapsed within a period of 5 to 10 years. That's a problem. If you have a 40% failure in a particular model, that's not a good model.
All right, Prof. Now, do you think that Africa should develop its own model of peace settlement?
Yes, of course. The thing is, the challenge with conflict resolution in Africa, in spite of the rhetoric about African solutions to African problems, is that there is nothing original about how we try to resolve our conflicts. If you look at the African solutions to African problems, it's simply sending African envoys to do the same things that Western envoys do in Africa. So there has to be an African model. A case in point, if you look at, there's what you call the Center of Excellence presently in African indigenous knowledge systems. There are traditional methods of resolving conflict in Africa. There are traditional methods of indigenous post-conflict justice, like they did in Rwanda, Gacaca. And why did they do that? When the RPF arrived Kigali, the central bank was empty. There were no offices. They started from a tabula rasa. It was an empty country. Kagame could not even get $5 million to pay workers. And everybody in Rwanda was affected. Either you're a victim or you're a perpetrator in the genocide. And consequently, how do you actually, where are the courts where you'll take people to? There were about 12 lawyers and 7 judges left after the genocide in the entire country. So how do you start putting them through that process? So they now move to what? An African indigenous method called the Gacaca, where they meet under trees and sort out issues. Because the system of justice in Africa looks at the continuity of the society. The system of justice from the West looks at punitive measures. So it's totally different. We have to take our indigenous knowledge seriously. I'm not saying entirely Western approaches are all wrong. Let's have what is good, but then let's do some kind of triangulation with what we actually have, because we have original methods which actually work and have some level of legitimacy.
All right, Prof. Now, in one of your books, Peace Building in Sub-Saharan Africa, the African Perspective, you describe the liberal peace paradigm as a new colonial invention which is ineffective. You just mentioned that moments ago, but I'd like you to highlight more on that. Why do you believe so?
All international institutions and processes are liberal. They fall within the liberal paradigm, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then that's when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History. You know, history had come to an end. We now have the liberal democratic system. Now, if you look at the 90s, most African countries talked about, they now had to adopt democracy. Multipartism, I'll call it multipartism, not necessarily democracy. So they had to adopt multipartism, and there were now fissures. These fissures came as a result of the fact that people's mindsets were not prepared for competition. And therefore, a lot of the incumbents and those countries that had political parties brought a new concept of what? The dominant political party. Yeah. You know, and so it has still not worked, because if you look at the unemployment rates during the periods of dictatorship and the unemployment rates during the period of democracy, there isn't much difference. I facilitated a course on governance and development in the UN Training Institute in Dakar, where there were economists from 40 African countries. One of the things we looked at was that the English-speaking countries have more political transitions, more than the French-speaking African countries. A case in point, in the Central African region, you don't find any former president in any of the countries. You don't find somebody who was a president and he's still in the country. Yes. But then, if you look at the levels of illiteracy, look at the levels of poverty, you look at the levels of unemployment, in both the English and French countries, it's the same. So it tells you that political transition has actually not brought about economic development. You know. So you have political transitions. In some areas, you don't have political transitions, but the output is the same.
Which means there's a governance lapse somewhere.
Absolutely. So that neoliberal system, it's still not working. Now we have what they call what? Electoral democracy. You know, because when you talk about democracy, you know, election is just one element of democracy. There has to be checks and balances, separation of powers, human rights, and so on and so forth. But then the focus is on fixing the politics, and therefore everyone focuses on political transitions, and that's why they talk about term limits and so on. You look at over 50 years of the implementation of development models, you have only about 4 countries that have moved from third world to first world. You know, and if you look at them, Singapore is a city-state. You know, you look at Taiwan, you look at South Korea, it was occupied, the southern part was occupied by the Western powers. You look at Japan. So Even the Asian tigers like Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, you still have elements of serious poverty in a lot of areas, you know. And so these models have actually not worked for us. And that's why Lee Kuan Yew, the founder prime minister of Singapore, said, developing countries don't need democracy, they need discipline. And that's the approach President Kagame is taking in Rwanda.
Well, even though some will say he's dictatorial and...
Yes, you don't eat democracy, you
so
eat food.
Not. Yeah, sure. All right. Now, you just mentioned these new models which the international community can take. Now, who should make the first step in trying to implement them?
You see a lot of African countries, especially using institutions like the African Union, which needs to be strengthened. But I sometimes describe the African Union as a group of incompetent African governments put in one building. It needs to be strengthened and given power. Because the African Union is there. Why did it actually change from the OAU to the AU? It's because the OAU was limited to fighting colonialism in all its forms. But they now thought that, okay, let's say we have gained political independence, but not economic independence. Consequently, we need an institution that addresses the present challenges. But then who funds the AU? We did a study and realized at some point that the peace and security budget, about 90% of the peace and security budget of the AU is externally funded. He who pays the piper,
of course,
dictates the tune. Why can African countries not pay for their things? Why don't they put money where their mind is? That's the challenge. And therefore, the Western countries will keep dictating what happens here.
Okay, Prof. Now, there's been so much talk, so much advocacy about the role peace education can play in resolving conflict. Of course, you are in that particular sector of peace education. How relevant is it in our time?
It's very, very important. That's why you see the United Nations University for Peace was created to lessen the obstacles to peace. And that is what peace education does, to lessen the obstacles to peace. And what you find in a lot of African countries when you talk about peace education, they think you need to preach to people to live peacefully. Peace education would mean teaching people how to deal with poverty. Peace education will mean teaching people how to create jobs. Peace education will mean developing your communities, providing clean drinking water, providing health facilities. That is peace education. It is not holding conferences and preaching to people to live in peace. So, in other words, peace building means dealing with the root causes of conflict. And what are those root causes? Poverty, unemployment, underdevelopment, you know. So that's peace education. So you have to deal with those challenges.
And now, what challenges do you think governments are facing in their efforts to ensure that peace education becomes a reality?
You know, it's a novelty in a lot of African countries. Peace education had been in the Scandinavian countries for a very, very long time. Look at our dear country. The first batch of conflict resolution students from the University of Buea just graduated. 3 years. And we have had a conflict in the Anglophone regions for about 5 years.
Five years.
So the programs to build capacity are actually younger than the problem itself. You know, there had to be some level of foreseeability for the development of these programs, because for those of us who are watchers of most of these African countries from outside, there's nothing surprising about what is happening here. There was nothing surprising about what happened in Ethiopia. The early warning systems are there. But then a lot of leaders are not proactive to address these kinds of things. But strangely, in Cameroon, we have capacity, because I can tell you that you would not go to a UN peacekeeping operations without finding Cameroonians. Cameroonians are there. So you have this capacity which our country can draw from that experience and deal with our own challenges. Many African countries don't have that.
Now, despite the emergence of international organizations, most of them with very good policies, when they preach, we find that their actions are inactive on the ground. Are international organizations still useful in our modern society?
International organizations are very useful However, it depends on which type of international organization you're talking about, because there are institutions that deal with global politics. There are institutions that deal with global economic governance. In global economic governance, you talk about the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the WTO, and so on and so forth. You have institutions that deal with global issues of justice, you know, the ICC and some ad hoc processes. Then, if you look at that, at the regional level, they have replicated them. The African Union has the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the African Human Rights Court in Arusha, and so they have replicated that at the regional level, and countries are supposed to domesticate a lot of those things. So you have all these institutions actually working. So they are very, very important. However, where I have a beef with international institutions and processes has to be in the area of NGOs. The NGOs, you have to look at where their funding is coming from. I can give you an example. You have Friedrich Ebert Foundation. You have Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Most people don't know these are political foundations. Konrad Adenauer Foundation is linked to the CDU party in Germany. Friedrich Ebert is linked to the SDP party in Germany, which means that it is their foreign policy, the German foreign policy, that is implemented in these African countries. So you would find Konrad Adenauer Foundation funding classical security issues, police training, military training, and all those kinds of things, human rights in military issues. Then you find Friedrich Ebert funding soft security issues, as they say, gender, climate change, those kinds of things. So these two institutions get their money from the same pot, the German parliament, and therefore they are implementing the German foreign policy. People have to know that. So consequently, they are not here to help. They are here to implement their policies. Norwegian Refugee Council, they are implementing the Norwegian foreign policy. It's called soft power. Have you actually looked at USAID, United Nations Agency for International Development, what is written beneath? From the American people. They get their budget from the State Department. What is the State Department? It's the Foreign Affairs Ministry of the United States.
Yeah.
Okay? So people have to stop thanking them. What you simply need to do is to stop doing those things that will bring them in. Because when they are coming in, they are coming to implement their own foreign policy, which is in the interest of their countries, not yours.
And this may likely explain why conflicts in Africa hardly die out.
No, they can't. They can't, because you call it the NGO project, the NGO business. I can give you another example. We conducted a study in Kenya. Kenya has, there's this refugee camp in Nairobi, which is one of the biggest slums in Africa. There were 600 NGOs working in that slum. For more than 10 years, they had raised almost $30 billion to work in these slums, but the place is still a slum. How do they raise money? They need hungry people, photographs of hungry people, displaced people, poor people, illiterates, for them to be able to raise money.
For their advocacy.
Yes, so it is not in their interest for this place to be transformed. It is not. Another thing we found in the study is that you would realize about 80% of their budget goes for administrative purposes, salaries, travel, and so on and so forth. And 20% goes to what they're actually supposed to do. And therefore, there is no transformation of these societies as a result of those NGOs. A case in point with the Anglophone conflict that we have now, you find someone comes out of the university with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree and earns 500,000 francs. That is higher than category A2, which is the highest echelon in the Cameroon public service. Now, do you think this person wants this NGO to go? No, not at all. So in the international system, where we need a lot of understanding is this area of NGOs. And it's critically important for us to make sure that we don't create this environment for them to come, because once they are in, they don't leave. It takes a very long time.
Now, we see that most governments are at conflict with these NGOs that you have cited. The case in point is Cameroon, where some of them have been accused of helping
Doctors Without Borders
separatist fighters.
Them,
yeah,
yes.
Doctors Without Borders in particular was accused of helping separatist fighters. How can these NGOs and the government come to a mutual understanding?
You have the principle of neutrality in how NGOs should work. This principle of neutrality binds, they're not supposed to take sides. And that is the argument most NGOs will take, for instance, say Doctors Without Borders as an example. But then, Doctors Without Borders does not just come into a country and does what it wants. It signs an MOU with the government, and the MOU has a lot of things that they're supposed to do. Most people don't read that fine print. Now, the first question you have to ask yourself, who is funding Doctors Without Borders? Once you know who is funding doctors, where they get their money from, then you understand whose policy they are implementing in that particular place. Now, I am not privy to the information regarding how the Cameroon government suspended the work of Doctors Without Borders. I'm not privy to those details. But the bottom line is this. I know most times with the MOUs, you have the responsibility of informing, okay? Because without which the country cannot just throw its independence. Yes, you have the responsibility of informing, but not the responsibility of handing over, okay? So if a separatist fighter is injured and the fight comes to an end and Doctors Without Borders finds this guy who is injured, if they are treating that person, they have a responsibility to inform the government. They have no responsibility to hand that separatist fighter to the government. From what the information I got was that they were not informing the government. So if they treat this separatist fighter and let him loose and he kills government officers, you can bet that the government will react differently.
All right, now many people have been calling for peace, but another aspect which some observers say must be strengthened is the aspect of justice. What do you have to say about it? So some will tell you they cannot be peace without justice and so on. A case in point is the Anglophone crisis. When the government calls for peace, some of those who may not like government's policies will say government first of all have to try those who are responsible for the crimes in order for lasting peace to come.
You see, once you have already allowed negative peace situation to degenerate into violent conflicts like we have had in the Anglophone conflict, then resolving it, you have to swallow some very bitter pills. Of course, if from the research we have done over the years on how conflicts have been resolved, one of the things you'll find is that at some point you have to give some criminals a soft landing if you actually want peace. There's this debate about people who say they want justice before peace. Some say they want peace before justice. It's a chicken and egg argument. However, the approach has to be that you need peace first. And for you to be able to have that peace, you have to give some hardened criminals soft landing. A lot of times, that is what happens. That's why there's a concept of amnesty. You know, that's why there's a concept of amnesty, which means that you forgive people who have committed wrongs. In the gacaca approach in Rwanda, you come and say what you did. I attended some of them, and there was this incident where one woman said, "You killed my son." And the man said, "Yes, I killed your son, but from today I'm your son." And he decided to do what the son was supposed to do until the man passed away. But to Westerners, this guy just confessed. Okay? He confessed murder.
And he would have been tried.
He would have been tried.
The Western system. And
yes, but for our system, you are giving this person a soft landing. You know, because our outcome of justice is what? Continuity of the society.
Okay, Prof. Now, the youths are very key to the survival of every society. What role can they play? Because some will argue that those who are in power, that's the elderly, make the decisions which they don't have control, and they are like the actors and victims at the same time. What role can the youths play in fostering peace?
The youths have a very, very important role in fostering peace. Of course, it's a huge challenge in terms of the age. The average age of African leaders is around 65 years. And 65% of the population in Africa is less than 35 years. So there's a big gap between the governors and the governed. They don't speak the same language. They don't live in the same society. And therefore, there's a lost generation between 35 years and maybe 55. In Cameroon, when you're 50, they say you are a youth.
Yeah,
you know?
sure.
And it's understandable when you have people in power who are in their 80s. So a 50-year-old person is a young person. So that's understandable. But the youths have a very, very important role to play. At the end of the day, the youths are the ones voting, but there's voter apathy amongst the youths.
The youths.
They're supposed to get involved because except it's a situation or a process whereby the vote does not count. If it actually counts, then the youths have power. But then another thing you find in Africa, which is strange, and it's in a lot of African countries, the youths don't support other youths, just like women don't support women. Yeah, but you look at our population, it might be about 52% women. And about 48% men. But then, let a woman stand for a powerful position, other women wouldn't vote her. The same thing is happening to youths. And they call women and youths marginalized. They marginalize themselves most times. If somebody wants to be president and is 36 years in Cameroon, they'll say, no, that one is too young to be president.
Is too young.
Forgetting to know that the people who are in power got to power at that same age. You know, so the youths have a very, very important role. Secondly, the youths have to prepare themselves for leadership positions. There's so much information out there, but very little knowledge. There's a high level of irresponsibility, especially with the internet coming. A lot of youths now are looking for fast ways of actually making money. And so they are pathetical to political processes where power actually comes from, because the economy has to, the decisions in the economy have to be made by people who are in political power, yes. So they have to prepare themselves for those and really get involved and actually study well to be able to be responsible citizens.
Okay, Prof. Recently you were in Somalia where you met the President Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud. Why did you embark on this important trip? We know Somalia is a very key country in Africa which gets lots of attention for the numerous challenges which it's facing.
Somalia is an interesting one. You know, I call Somalia the Afghanistan of Africa. Yeah. Somalia is a country which did not have a government for more than 20 years. That will be beyond comprehension for anybody. A country does not have a government. So how does it function? I met President Hassan Sheikh because he is my doctoral student. I'm supervising his thesis. He's almost done with his PhD. So I knew him before he ran for president. And I taught him the course on governance and public policy. And therefore, when he won the elections, he invited me for the inauguration and actually sent a message that I should not leave until we meet. And so a few days later, he sent his director of civil cabinet for us to organize a meeting because he needed me to advise on certain very important things, projects and programs to implement. Somalia is at its crossroads now. This is the third transition. They're operating within the context of a provisional constitution. Somalia election is an election where people don't vote. You know, I don't know whether you know that.
Voting by clans.
Yes, they have a strange system they call 4.5 clans, which means the four major clans are those that took up weapons against Yad Barre, and the half are the clans that did not take up weapons. And therefore, selection of members of parliament takes place within the clans, and the members of parliament elect the president. And the provisional constitution of 2012 wants to migrate that clan system to a universal suffrage, one man, one vote. And that is President Hassan Sheikh's PhD research, the challenge of clan politics in Somalia. So the clan elders have a lot of power, and it is so difficult to forfeit that power. So that's the major challenge. So we had a very, very extensive meeting, and I'll be going back there in 3 weeks.
Now, what role can an institution like the UN University for Peace, where he's a student, play in trying to resolve some of the problems in the country?
First of all, the objective of the University for Peace in Africa is to strengthen African institutions in teaching, training, research, and development in the area of peace, conflict, governance. That's the objective. We strengthen institutions. One of the first projects I managed was to strengthen 30 institutions in Africa by providing scholarships to doctoral students who are now invited to come. I take most of them to teach in Somalia. We first of all build their capacity. Let me tell you something about Somalia, why UPeace is very important there. Because there was no government for more than 20 years, Somalia has universities where vice chancellors do not even have a PhD. Vice chancellors, where you'll find an entire university. I say these are glorified high schools, okay? Yes, you find an entire university where in the top administration, nobody has a PhD. So one of the first things we need to do is to build the capacity of tertiary institutions in Somalia. That is one of the things UPeace is going to do. We are going to select a good number of those universities. We are looking at between 10 and 15, depending on the budget, and select at least 15 to 20 lecturers there who all don't have a PhD in the 15 to 20 universities, and put them through PhD programs. Now, once you have an institution with 20 PhD holders, they are going to produce a lot of masters. The multiplier effect is going to be amazing. Yeah. So that is the first thing we're going to do. Based on my background, I also advise on a political economist within the context of peace studies.
Peace studies.
Yes, and so we advise on issues of focusing on human security. I actually told the president the approach Cameroon took, and I told him, I said, in Addis Ababa, if you find a diplomat from Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Congo Brazzaville, Benin Republic, Togo, he comes from Cameroon. He studied in Cameroon because you had these specialized schools. So if you meet 10 translators and interpreters, 9 are from Cameroon. Okay. So I said, we have to take this approach and create these professional schools to be able to build the capacity, because countries don't develop because they have natural resources. They develop because they have human resources. You don't need natural resources to develop. You need human resources.
The case in point is the DRC.
DRC is too rich to be stable.
Stable.
Yes, the resource cost is in DRC. So a lot of people tell you about natural resources and so on. You don't need natural resources to develop. You need human resources, because with the Somalia has natural resources, but has no human resources. And therefore, the natural resources are actually useless. So the approach we want to push the Somalia government is to be able to build that capacity, to be able to manage these natural resources, and the rest will be history.
All right, Prof, let's go back to the UN. In recent times, there have been calls for reforms within the United Nations in a bid to tackle the present challenges. They say that the models that came out in 1945 are not adapted to the current situation. Do you agree that the UN should adopt new reforms?
Absolutely, the UN needs to be reformed. Come on, an organization that was created in 1945 is still the same, by and large. The Security Council, with the 5 permanent members with veto powers, do what they want, and the others do what they must. And consequently, that is not right. The world has changed. And therefore, the UN has to change with the world. They changed they moved from the OAU to the AU because things had changed. But the UN has been static. Look at the situation of Russia and Ukraine. Russia was chairing the Security Council on an issue. When
the war broke out.
Yes, Russia was chairing the Security Council in a war that it is involved.
Yeah.
And so it vetoes everything. It is the chair. So how can you be the judge or the referee and the player in the same game?
Time.
You know, so that's a challenge. You would hear when they started talking about UN reform, especially the Security Council, in South America, Brazil and Argentina, they wanted to be permanent members. In Asia, India and Japan, they wanted to be permanent members. In Africa, you had South Africa, you had Nigeria, you had Egypt. You know, all these countries were trying to be there. If you look at the UN budget, about 19.1 or 19.2% is funded by the United States. I think Japan comes third in terms of funding the United States because they are tasked according to their economy.
Their economy.
Yeah, but Japan is not a permanent member, but it pays more than many other countries into the UN purse. And therefore, why would you not give Japan a permanent seat? Japan was a defeated power in the Second World War. Yeah. Why would you not give Germany a permanent seat? Germany pays more than many other countries. Germany pays more money into the UN than France. But France is a permanent member and Germany is not. You know, so the UN has not adapted to the changing world. The world has been changing very fast, but the UN remains the same. So for the UN to be more efficient, it has to be representative. It is not.
Now, where do you see the world from here? Where does the world go from here with all these challenges vis-a-vis the search for peace?
You would realize that the war in Ukraine made a lot of people in the north were kind of surprised that white people could also be killed in wars and so on and so forth. They always think it has to happen in Africa. 70% of violent conflicts in the world in Africa. 90% of UN peacekeeping is in Africa. So they expect Africans to be fighting and killing themselves. Because Western countries became nations before they became states. In Africa, we are states. We are trying to become nations. So there's always going to be this inconsistency, and therefore there will always be violence. How do I see the world? In the African continent, I'm sorry to disappoint you that there will still be conflicts over a long period of time. Because you have not seen the political will to deal with those issues. Look at what's happening now between Rwanda and DR Congo. Yeah. You know, the East African community is trying to deal with it. The DR Congo has just called for American help. America is not coming to help anybody there. You know, I've been in the eastern part of Congo, in Goma, in Bukavu. It's a totally different country from the DR Congo itself. You have runways in the forest.
In the forest.
They have minerals which are found in every cell phone, but there's no cell phone company there. You know, so everybody is there. The Chinese are there. The Americans are there. They are talking about Rwanda. There are many countries, other countries that are exploiting the minerals, Indians and so on, Russians. They are all there. Everybody is exploiting. Now, you look at the Horn of Africa, it's a challenge. The Gulf countries are all there. In Somalia, it's a fight between United Arab Emirates, the Qataris. While sitting there during the inauguration of the president, as an analyst, I'm looking at things. You can see who's speaking, and it tells you who has more influence, what country has more influence, because they have one of the longest coastal regions in Africa, from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Yeah, and so we are moving towards a multipolar world. The war in Ukraine has shown two things. We're moving towards a multipolar world because India and China actually support Russia. That's half of the world's population. Yeah. They are supporting Russia. This Western arrogance of expanding NATO is actually backfiring. Anybody who had been reading these things had warned the Westerners that it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
But nobody paid attention. Russia has had a lot of influence in Africa, and therefore about 26 African countries abstained from condemning Russia at the General Assembly. Sure. So the world is balancing up. We are moving towards a multipolar world. China holds about almost $2 trillion of American debt. So, you know, Lord Keynes, who developed the World Bank, once said that if you owe the bank a little bit of money, it's your problem.
It's your problem.
But if you owe the bank plenty of money, it's the bank's problem as well. So, United States owes China so much money that it is also China's problem. And so these two countries will hardly fight. So at the end of the day, while they are knocking their heads, the powerful nations are doing what they want, and the weak nations are doing what they must. I'm not very optimistic, but that's the world we live in.
All right. Professor Samuel Ewusi Kale, thank you very much for talking to us. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to speaking to you as many times as possible.
Of course, we always have time to call you for other editions of the program. And to you, televiewers, it was a massive pleasure having you in this edition of the program. Until next time, it's bye-bye.